Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Kane. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollykane.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us. All right, friends, welcome to the podcast today. We are so excited to be here with Jo Saxton. So, Jo, welcome to the show. We are really excited to be chatting with you today.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah. So to kick us off, for anyone who might not know about you and what you do, could you share a little bit about yourself and what your life and leadership looks like right now?
Okay. So I am by birth, I grew up in London. I'm Nigerian family, but I live in Minneapolis or in the Minneapolis area. I, like many people, I guess, wear a lot of hats. So I'm a speaker, author, although I say author because I did books, not because I'm actually thinking of ever writing again. But I host a podcast. But my main focus is on investing in women leaders. So I host a digital community, an online community of women leaders who are across the fields, across the spheres of leadership. Some of them are corporate, some of them are in ministry, some of them nonprofit, but they're in different countries around the world. And then I founded an initiative called the Aza Collective, which is an intensive, that's a kind of like 2-day intensive where we kind of gather women leaders, again, across the spheres of influence to kind of retreat to advance. So women leaders are my thing. I'm very excited about them and will rant to people about them all day.
Well, then you are in the right place because we have lots of women leaders.
Yay.
We love talking to female leaders, and we, like you, also have lots of multi-passionate women who wear lots of hats. So I think we found our people and we're sticking with it. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your leadership journey and how you've developed as a leader over the years, and perhaps when you realized you were a leader the first time.
Oh, gosh. I think I often say to people, I was the last to work out I was a leader. And I kind of talk to people often about, like, what's your leadership origin story? And I think for me, I go back to school where captain in sports teams, or if there was some classroom responsibility, I was it. And even in my youth group at church, I was often involved in things, but I saw it as something I did, not part of who I was, because I didn't feel worthy enough in many ways. And so it probably wasn't until my late teens, early 20s when I actually realized I was a leader. I think people had maybe told me enough times that it was beginning to sink in that I might be. Do you know what I mean? And I was already involved in things. I was speaking then. I became a Christian and grew up in a Methodist church where there were a small Methodist church and a range of opportunities. So I was already actively involved. And I think I was just often the person who was the buck stop for the drama in our peer group. Do you know what I mean? I just happened to be that joyous, happy life. So I think for me, the journey kind of began to take shape more in my early 20s. And I was volunteering a lot in the context of church. I was involved in the youth group, and then I ended up leading the youth group, or I moved to a church that had a lot of young adults and got involved with college kids. And it just was the thing I did. And ended up working for a church for a while as a youth pastor. I wasn't a very good youth pastor. I was very boring, but partly because I loved the youth. I always loved them, but I was really interested in the leaders. Do you know what I mean? I wanted to invest in them. And so when I look back, there's always been this thread of wanting to invest in leaders in some way or another. And in every chapter of my life, there has been this kind of leadership thing of how do you empower and invest in people so they can be what God called them to be.
I love that, Jo. And I'm curious to know when you felt the shift or when you recognized the shift. You said that for a while you saw leadership just as something that you did and not who you were. So was there a point where God shifted that in you and you recognized that that is who you are?
I can think of a couple. One was almost like it kind of grew on me because you find delight in the things that you're doing active. And I was speaking more and more. So I think that was one of the pieces of this thing that was impactful. But I think one of the moments where it really shifted was actually quite a painful one. There was a guy I was involved with in my 20s, and it was like, will they, won't they? And the quick answer to that, friends, they won't. But I apparently didn't need to see the obvious. I need to go all around the houses for about a year trying to work out whether there was something going on, all that kind of thing. And in my mind at that time, I couldn't get ahead of me being fully as the person I was will be and nagging the man. And it was very much like, if I want to settle down, I better settle down. Kind of was the vibe in my mind. I'm not even, and he didn't put that on me. I think it was just some of the kind of low-key messages I kind of absorbed and picked up along the way. And there was a moment when I was at an event and I'd spoken, and my team who were praying with me afterwards and thought, this is good. You know, I fought to get here. I fought past my insecurities, into inadequacy, some of the painful chapters of my past. I've had to do a lot of work as do you know what I mean? And it's been tears. It really has. And I've got vision and ideas for things, and I don't think they're bad. And it was almost like this moment of me saying to myself, this is you. This is who you are. If he's not in love with you, if he doesn't love you, it's okay. I mean, it's going to be devastating, but you can't. And again, I don't think he was doing this. I think I was kind of in this space where I was like, if he doesn't love you and if he doesn't want you, you've got to show up as who you are, because this is fearfully and wonderfully made. And I had to not just apply that to my body being fearfully and wonderfully made. I had to apply it to my wiring, the way God made me. Wasn't an accident. And, you know, he and I had defined the relationship, and it was really painful. It was really, really painful. But at the same time, there was this, but you know what? This time I'm going to be me. And this journey through this part of the journey, and, you know, we became friends later on in life and all that kind of stuff. But, do you know what I mean? So, like, again, in some ways, he was a part kind of whirlwind that was happening within my own heart, and me actually saying, it's time to stop apologizing for how you're wired, what you've been given, and how you're called. Just do it.
As you were talking, I was kind of just thinking, isn't it so funny that we're born as this person and then we spend the rest of our lives and life experience understanding our gifts and all of those, be the expert on ourselves. And I don't know about you, but I still don't know who I am.
No, I'm with you, because it changes as well. You know, I would love to say that was on one level in my 20s, that was the moment. It was miserable, but that was a moment. But then there was another in my 30s where I had to reconfigure again and say, okay, who am I now in this new country, and which I'm trying to get used to? And I've got these babies who I adore, and my body doesn't seem to align itself with what my desires. Do you know what I mean? And what I'm anticipating happens when I laugh and all that kind of stuff. I'm like, what are we doing here, guys? What are we doing? Get together. I have been potty trained. Yeah. Nothing is what it was. And I have a life, and I knew the leader I was in the UK. Who was I going to be in the US now when I have a very different life? And again, in my 40s, there has been the journey of saying, okay, who are you now? And you know, now I'm about to hit 50. It's like I'm coming back to the Lord and saying, okay, I'm going to cut out the middleman. Could you tell me? Could you just...
Yep.
Can we have some expediency here on my midlife crisis, as now the hot flashes decide to kind of show me jazz hands? Who am I becoming in this moment? So yeah, I think you have to go back to it again and again.
Like, Lord, am I supposed to buy a flashy sports car or not? Like, what?
Yeah. Shall I ask you afterwards? I think the other lesson I learned in my 30s is that really you do need a village. You do need support. And that's okay. You know, you're growing and you're discovering and you're learning, but who are your peers that are gathering around you who are making your life work? And it's okay that there are these conflicting feelings and conflicting thoughts and how you do this stuff, and that you're feeling things you didn't expect to feel. Like, there's a disorientation. And I think in my 30s, it was having the kids close together and then experiencing significant grief not long after. I think my youngest was maybe around 1. So 2 kids in 18 months, that was a plan. And then I just didn't know what I was planning. And then, like, the death of 2 major family members. And so there was this swirl of confusion, grief, loss, and realizing I can't. One person can't. You need people. And I think the other lesson over the years is I know stuff. Do you know what I mean? I'm not stupid. Do you know that if you learn these lessons from your failures and your successes and from just your experience, you don't have to doubt yourself anymore. There are things that you see and you get and you know. And I think that has been an increasing part of the leadership lessons I've learned. Those are the ones that come to mind today anyway.
Okay, we're going to have to come back to that second one. I'm going to have to circle back to that because I love that lesson. But I want to dive into this idea of just women in leadership. I know you said this is your passion. This is something you are driven to help and encourage women in leadership. But first, I want to ask, why do you think, or do you think that women struggle to step up into leadership? Is this something that you see as a challenge or a problem?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. I think it was Marion Wright Edelman who said, you can't be, or it's hard to be what you can't see. And one of the things I've learned over the years, and I've experienced over the years, is this sense of, you know, when I think of Christian women in particular, you have this faith and it's passionate, and you go to the church and you hear all these stories. You very rarely hear the stories of women. You hear about Mary at Christmas, which is great. And even that, you hear about her willingness, but we don't hear much about the prophetic song and the insight you have. You hear about Anna. On Mother's Day, you'll hear about another woman, maybe, whether that woman was a mother or not. But when you grow up here in the Bible, I would ask, how many times did anybody preach on Lydia, a businesswoman, on Shira, who built 3 towns, on Huldah, an advisor to the kings, on Deborah, on Miriam? How many times were there stories? I mean, you hear about Eve, and even that, not the redemptive part of her story. And I think that does create a picture and a vacuum of knowing what we could be. We hear about the Proverbs 31 woman, but not actually what she did. And you have these bits snipped out and watercolored around her. And I think that leaves an impact, because actually the Bible has a range of women, multi-ethnic, multi-generational, who are each in their own unique ways, working out what it means to be faithful to God in their time and in their context. When you don't have those stories, you don't get to see yourself. You don't know if you're there. If you get to hear about how women should behave and not what these women actually did, what they actually accomplished, you know, what would it mean for a woman who's in business to hear that Lydia was doing all these things and was a gateway to Europe for the church? What does that do to your vision? So I think that's one of the reasons why for women it can be hard to step into their calling, because they've not heard the stories. And the narrative is about behavior, not about purpose. It's about personality type, not about purpose, about not getting things wrong and getting it right rather than about calling. So I think that's one. And I think, again, if you don't see it, it's hard to be it. So if you haven't seen that in your world, in your community, what women stepping into leadership may look like, no one's having those conversations with you. Sometimes the how just can be quite debilitating. If you don't know how to make it work, you just don't try, because the stakes are too high and it's too hard and all that kind of stuff. So I think those are some of the immediate things in terms of why it's been hard. And I think socially, there are certain things that have been expected of women that have made it that culturally are ascribed to women, whether they're fully true or not. And I don't want to say an either or. I'm just saying not only one way. And if you don't hear that your gifts and your contribution are part of how God designed you, and that things he's excited about, what do you do with that? What do you do with your ambition? It's just confusing, easier to check out.
I so agree with that. I think that there has to come a point for each woman individually where she might recognize what you're saying and then dig deeper for herself. It's not so blatantly there. And this is not technically our next question, but why do you think it's not there for us to see? Why do you think those stories, I don't want to use the word hidden, but why are they not more in the forefront? Why are some churches afraid to step into those stories and talk about the women of the Bible the way that you are mentioning?
I mean, in some ways, I'd ask the people who are the gatekeepers to that question. I mean, I think it's a live question. It's like, why don't you talk about Huldah? And why don't you talk about these? And they may say, you know, there's far more on Daniel, there's far more on Joseph. And there is, but there's not nothing about those women. There's not nothing. And there's definitely not nothing about Deborah. There's not nothing about Lydia or Phoebe or Priscilla. And do you know what I mean? And the list and the list and the list goes on. I think sometimes when it's come to how women should be, we've honed in almost obsessively on individual verses and used that to translate everything else, rather than allowing what is real clear about the Bible, what's really clear about the women who existed, to inform even those verses and to speak to those. So it's funny because it's like you're right, they're not hidden. They're hidden in plain sight. Joanna, Susanna, and Mary in the New Testament traveling with Jesus is actually already there. But we have often not really dug deep into what their world's like and what the implications of those things are for us today. Maybe we've not seen them as applying to everybody. Whereas I look at Daniel and I look at David in the Bible, and I look at Jacob or Joseph and their stories and their weaknesses and their strengths, and they apply to my life regardless of gender. And I actually think that's true for Deborah and Huldah and Shira and Lydia and Priscilla and Phoebe and Chloe. The lessons from their life and their presence applies to us regardless of gender. So there's actually no reason to not tell their stories.
Yeah. And I just think as I'm listening to you, I'm sure there are names that we as people who've grown up in the church for so long, we don't recognize.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Names that you've listed, we don't recognize. So, okay, let's get back to my actual list of questions, because I feel like I could go down that tangent for a long time. But I think it totally relates. Do you believe that women bring something different or unique to the table as leaders? I think there was an emergence. We had an emergence of leaders in maybe the 90s and 2000s. And there was a lot of women who were stepping into leadership in the business space in a masculine way. And that was what leadership was kind of defined by for women. And so I'm wondering what you think women showing up authentically actually looks like. And is that something different and unique that they bring to the table?
I mean, I think it's going to be different and unique if you're living into the fullness of how you're made, because God made us that way. I think there are some, the range of women that exist, even the range of us on this podcast, we have different stories, different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different cultural experiences, different social locations, different stories. So that's going to bring a diversity. So I think, yes, I know for some, they may say women are more relationally minded, and maybe, but whatever they bring, it's going to be different because God has wired us that way. And when I say wired us that way, I mean wired humanity that way. And we know, like studies have shown again and again, that when you have the more diverse teams in companies, it's better for their bottom line. Why? Because we're not the same and we bring different perspectives. How we experience a product is different. What motivates us to buy a product, those things are different. So there's going to be greater brainstorming and different understandings of your audience and what matters and what's of meaning. I know in the area of development, often agencies will invest in women because they know that as they do that, they're more likely to impact the community in terms of children and health and education and all those things as well. I sometimes go back and forth, like when people say to me, do women have particular gifts that they bring and unique? I think so. But what I don't want to do is to limit us to say, well, the woman's like this then, because I think there's just such a range of women leaders, some who compel you to listen and others who invite you to listen, some who are really quiet, some whose gifts manifest themselves in their numbers and their engineering skills, and others through their creative skills, some who are more relational and some who aren't. I think the key thing is it authentic? I think that point you made, is it authentically how God wired them? Because if that's the case, then it's going to make a difference to your team in a positive way.
Yeah, that's so good. And I think it ties back to what you shared earlier about knowing who you are in your own journey as you got more and more clarity about who you are and how God has wired you. It allowed you to step into your leadership more effectively. So what do you think women need to believe about God or about themselves in order to start using our voice and stepping up with more confidence?
I would say, first of all, one of the things that I would want women to know is that that God enjoys them, that He loves them and He likes them, and that their gifts aren't an accident, that they are intentional. Like God didn't like look at you and think, oh my gosh, what did I do? Do you know what I mean? It's not like, oh my goodness, there's an ambitious one, or there's drop the vision in the wrong spot kind of thing. You're not standing there opposed to how the mold God had for you. He delights in the mold He broke in making you. He delights in that. And I think when you do this from a place of delight, God's delight and God's pride in you before you've done a thing, you'll function differently rather than if it's like, am I too much? Am I not enough? All those sorts of things. So that's one thing I think women need to know to use their voice, the basic foundations that God likes you, God enjoys you, et cetera, et cetera. The other piece that I'm almost low key, I would say this in Target if I needed to, because I just say it all the time now. I think we have understood our identity so often in the through the Genesis picture of women being a helper. And we often bring our 21st century understanding to helper. When you and I think of helper, we think of assistant, we think of backup. We don't think it's bad, because it isn't bad to help. And it's definitely not bad to serve at all. It's just that when we've done that, we sometimes miss the fullness of that word. And the word in the Hebrew is Azer. I could be pronouncing that wrong. It's ancient Hebrew. I wasn't there. But it's a Hebrew word with a combination of words meaning to rescue, to save, and to be strong, which already begins to flip our understanding of what that means about our identity. And we're not even talking about position or leadership yet. We're just talking about your very core identity. And when you're not sure of a word in the Bible, you see where else it shows up. There's 100 references to the root of this word in the Old Testament, about 21 with the exact use of that word. 16 of them are God delivering his people from their enemies. A couple of times referring to a woman, another time referring to military aid. And so when we see scriptures like God is our refuge and our strength and ever-present help in times of trouble, that's the word where we see it again. And it makes sense, because as image bearers, we're reflecting him in some way. But that's a very different picture of our identity and purpose than what we've sometimes assumed that being. And the reason why I come back to that again in terms of using our voice and owning our voice is you don't live beyond what you believe to be true about yourself. You certainly aren't going to use your voice beyond what you believe to be true about yourself. If you feel you can't think, if you feel you're not enough or too much, that will determine how you use your voice. If you genuinely believe that what you have to say is inadequate and you don't know enough and you're a burden, that will affect the tone of your voice, whether anything you say is worth listening to, and the contribution. You won't initiate anything with that. But if you know you're already loved, that you're already approved of, that you are not just, that you don't just have an identity, but a purpose with God, well, that shapes your outlook in a completely different way. There are different basic assumptions when you know that your identity and purpose are not rooted in your desire for power, and they're not rooted in whatever's happening in the cultural moment, but they're actually rooted in your design. Then it's about whether we will unwrap those gifts.
And what a solid foundation to go from. Mm-hmm. Because I think as leaders, or I know I've seen leaders kind of move and sway with whatever's happening in sort of society or, culture and that sort of thing. And so I think that having that strong foundation, that you're already approved, that you're already loved, that God already delights in you, I think is an amazing place to start from. I think that one of the things that I think about as I think about using my voice, or women using their voice to forward the kingdom.
Yeah.
How do I know when it's my voice or when I am being used as a conduit for God to speak? Like, how do I know if I'm in the way? How do I know if I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing? Mm-hmm. I feel like we get so caught up in what the voice is, who we're supposed to be talking to, platform, and all of those buzzwords, when really it comes down to how am I using the gifts God gave me? So how do I discern that?
I think it's a process, and I think it's okay that it's a process. The things that I find help me are, what are the basic things that I don't need God to tell me, like being struck by lightning is important. So I'm looking at like the Great Commission. Jesus calls us to make disciples. I'm like, whenever I'm not sure about how I'm meant to use my voice, I do always ask myself the question, who am I discipling in this chapter of my life? It's not always the same person. And with the work that I do, with the gifts that I have, with the life that I'm living, is there anybody else I'm investing in? And that'll look different for all of us, because I think, okay, that seems to be a non-negotiable. When I look at the Sermon on the Mount and the things that Jesus talks about, I'm like, okay, he's already said it here. Is there anything, there are certain things I can just pick up on that front. So there's some general principles in times of when I'm a bit confused that I come back to again and again. And then honestly, the thing with discernment is I would love it to be like a blueprint, but vision is a vision. It's not a blueprint. A blueprint tells you exactly what it's going to be, exactly how you're going to do it. And sometimes you don't know. And that's because that whole thing of walking by faith and not by sight is a thing. And so part of it is you try. And I would ask you, what's the environment that you have around you? Do you have people who, like genuine friends, not people who are jealous of you, because that gets weird, but like people who could be honest with you, that you can discern with together, that you can pray about things? There are some questions I ask myself when there's an idea. Does this fit with my season of life and the demands of my life? Because I'm called, sometimes your calling and your purpose is a who and not just a what. Do you know what I mean? So the household I'm in, the relationships that are important to me, is this going to upend it in an unhealthy way, or is it a good integration? And if it is going to upend it, who's in my village that helps me live this? I ask questions like, are there skills I need to learn to help step into this thing that I feel called to do? Does anybody else see this? Is this consistent with my vision and call? Is there a risk involved? And that's not because it shouldn't be risky. I just want to know. I just want to know in advance when I'm discerning what the risk is. I think those sorts of questions are worth asking, because sometimes, like you see in scripture, sometimes like David has a vision to build a temple and God's like, yeah, not yet and not you. This ain't yours. And so it is worth filtering your calling through a kind of checklist, not checklist, but kind of guidelines that maybe some wisdom. And so for that, I would recommend that we need people in our lives whom we trust, who can help us filter things for us. Maybe people who can trouble spot things that we need to say, this is great, this job and this opportunity, but this is going to change certain dynamics. So how do you want to attend to that? What do you need to stop so that you can do this? It doesn't mean it's wrong. Doesn't mean it's bad. It just means some changes in your world. I think that's part of it. I think an ongoing relationship with the Lord helps you recognize his voice, and ongoing praying and stuff. And I tend not to jump into things. I'm more likely to overthink, to be honest, but I tend not to jump into things. And so I'm waiting to see if there are some things that confirm it, that make sense for me. Others, I'm like, I can see this coming in the distance, but I can tell it's not right now. Sometimes if there's something I'm afraid of, I need a friend to be like, okay, what we need is to set a date by when you're going to do this thing. You know what I mean? Sometimes you need someone who's going to be concrete with you. If you're a really airy, fairy dreamer type person, and that's been the seedbed of your creativity, that's wonderful. But you're going to need someone who's like, yeah, so about in real life, when is this going to happen? So those are some of the things that I would encourage us to, because discernment's a process, not an achievement.
Yes. These are such good questions for us all to be putting into regular practice. So thank you for sharing those with us.
Thank you.
So I want to go back to what you said earlier, which I loved, because you said, I know stuff. Like at this stage of my life, I know stuff. And I think that a lot of us as female leaders, myself included, sometimes struggle to say that, to like really recognize what we actually do know. And that we have expertise and giftings that other people don't have, or that it looks different than other people. And I think the challenge with that is that we want to stay humble. Right. We want to be humble and we don't want to become arrogant. And so we err on the other side of it, where we don't even come to the point where we recognize what we know, or that we're willing to share what we know, because we're so worried about becoming arrogant. So what would you say to that? How do you stay humble, but also remain confident in what you do know?
Yeah, I mean, I do think women are very good. I think Christian women are very good at hiding their gifts and calling it humility. Do you know what I mean? I think we probably have a bit of we're quite talented at that we think it's humble by taking the credit for all the gifts and talents we have and burying them. And I'm like, come on now. Being humble is not about denying those things exist. Humility is about seeing yourself in the light of how God sees you. Well, God sees you with these gifts. So who's getting the credit, you or him? And we might be like, no, God gets all the credit. Well, not if you're hiding them, that he's not. Do you know what I mean? Or not if you're pretending they're not there, or saying, or playing it down, or saying you don't know the answer when you're in a situation and actually you do. That's called lying. Do you know what I mean? That's pretending. And we call it being humble because we don't want to get in the way. And it's like, yeah, but you had an answer that would help this community and go in that direction. And we're not doing that because, I don't want to be seen as arrogant. It's actually not about you. So I think there is sometimes I would ask us to ask ourselves, is what we're calling humility actually a version of pride? Because it's very self-centered in some way. So that's one of the things I will say that the great thing about the Lord and you stepping out into your gifts, and sometimes pride will come, but life has a way of humbling you. So, you know what I mean? He's got that covered. If you're staying in relationship with him, I wouldn't worry about it too much. And again, I want to remind us what this is about. This isn't, when we see our gifts as just purely part of our identity, it will feel like we're showing off. When we see it like an integral part of our purpose and contribution, then it is transformed to a viewpoint of service. So basically what you're doing with your gifts is saying, how can I be faithful to what God has put in me for human flourishing? You're not the end result. The kingdom of God is the end result. You are simply partnering with him in what he's already doing in the world and saying, I'm opening my snack box and sharing what I've got. That's all it is. And again, I think sometimes we need these little tweaks in our thinking that will help us ground these things in actual realities. And honestly, if you get really proud about it, tell God you're sorry and turn around. And, there are times when we might need to bench ourselves for a day and, and not stick around waiting for compliments. There are little practical things we can do, but please don't call it humility, denying what God has given you, because unless he's asked you to deny it, please don't call it humility, pretending that contribution, that could be a game changer for somebody else. And that can be your skill with making meals that'll help your neighbor in a time of need, all the way through to your idea for a company. Because we have to think, what things aren't happening because we're not living this stuff? What businesses aren't we starting? What charities aren't we beginning? And nonprofits aren't we starting? What sermons aren't being written? What businesses aren't being started? What songs aren't being written? What books aren't being written? All because we think we're being proud to say it. And the world is littered with the unmet dreams and visions of the things that we felt were arrogant to pick up. And I think sometimes what we call arrogance is obedience. And it may be time to say yes to some things. But if you're like, Jo, I get it, but I know me. If you know that actually there's an element for you which does get a bit kind of like, aren't I wonderful? Then that's something to be accountable about in healthy relationships with others. That's something to be accountable about. So someone's got you as you journey forward.
Oh my gosh, so many mic drops in that. I do want to take it a little step further because I've spoken to women where they are under leadership that they disagree with. And this is over lots of years. This is not, you know what I mean? Like, I've talked to many women and they see things that they're concerned their leadership is missing.
Yeah.
And so when I hear what you're saying, the question arises, how do we talk about the stuff we know, the gifts we've been given, the discernment that we have in places and spaces where we might not be welcome?
I would say this is a hard one. I think my views on this have evolved over the years. I think there would be a time when I'd be like, you've got to stay there and make sure they get through to you and all that kind of stuff. I think if you're not welcome, you're not welcome. I think of Jesus sending out the 12 and the 72, and he's like, don't go from house to house. Find the person of peace, the ones who welcome you, they're open to you, they serve you, stay there. But the ones who don't want to know, don't want to know. So now, and sometimes that's a process to work that out. So I've met many women who's like, I'm in a church and they don't believe in women in leadership, but I feel I'm called to this and et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, well, this is really awkward because they've been really clear about where they stand. And they've come to that through their own theological study, their own men and women come to that through their own theological study and discernment. This is where they land. I don't know that you're going to change them. And also, at what cost are you going to go down that journey? It may be that you say something and accept that the results may not go your way. I think sometimes using our voice is that we say what needs to be said, knowing at least I've been faithful. But again, I think on those things, success is not necessarily them changing. It's you being faithful to say what you've got to say. I would say if you're in a chronic situation where you're not welcome, then I would ask you why you're in a place where you're not welcome. Do you know what I mean? I think that what's the and sometimes there are reasons, sometimes they're like, I can't do this yet because my kids in the youth group and they're loving it and all that kind of stuff. Then you bide your time or whatever. I want to be practical about it, but I think you need to know why you're staying in a place where you're not welcome, rather than going to a place where you are welcome, where your gifts are welcome, where your voice is welcome, and living that. I actually think we should be curious about that question. Would you send your daughter into a place you wasn't welcome? Would you send your son into a place? So why are you taking it? And again, at what cost? I would love to say that having that kind of dynamic doesn't leave an impact, but I've watched it erode people again and again and again. The lack of affirmation, the lack of listening, the lack of encouragement, the slight irritation the other person gets with you because it's like, we've had this conversation before kind of thing. It has diminishing returns on your soul and potentially on your gifting as well. And my question is, if that's the case, and it's a question that someone's got to sit with, would it be healthier to find an environment where you are welcome and your voice is welcome, and then you can make a contribution there? And you may have to say certain things, but invest somewhere else.
Such a hard place to be, I think. Yeah.
It's really tough.
Yeah. And knowing whether it's time to pave the way for someone in the future or find somewhere that's already welcoming it feels heavy. Feels like a heavy decision.
I think it is a heavy decision because sometimes, because, not all our dreams come true. This isn't Disney. So on one level, sometimes you're right. There is a pioneering that is done. We talk about breaking the glass ceiling and don't think about how painful that is. Do you know what I mean? The shards of broken glass, the concussions, the bruises. And so you do have to count the cost, and you have to have that village of people who are going to support you. If you're like, no, I actually have to be here in this environment, or I have to stick this out, or whether sometimes it's not like a word from God, it's a word from the bills that are like, do you know what I mean? I've got to be here. And that it's not abusive, but it is difficult. It's tough because pioneering looks great later. At the time, it sucks. It's not glamorous. It's a lot of digging. It's hard work, and it's blood, sweat, and tears. And that is the call on us in certain things. Sometimes that's the only woman in the room vibe when you're in the board meeting or all that kind of stuff. But if that is what you're called to do, and if you've gone through your discernment process, then my question is what support and how long for? Like, you've got to keep on evaluating whether you're getting anywhere, because you can pioneer in different places as well.
Mm. So you talk to so many female leaders through the Azer Collective and the leadership community. I'm wondering what is something that female leaders are struggling with right now?
Mm-hmm.
What are the new challenges that maybe have taken you by surprise in recent time?
Yeah.
Or something different that's sort of developing for women leaders?
I think the highlights are still there. Do you know what I mean? I think the highlights are. I think what I'm hearing a lot more of is the degree of fatigue, like bone tired. And not just the fatigue of the doing, the fatigue from the complexity of leading in this current cultural moment. Do you know what I mean? Where there is progress in some places and not in others, where I think the fatigue that has come from the grind of trying to be faithful to your call and just the complexity of the times, I think almost the aftermath, the longer term aftermath of the emergence of Me Too in recent years is this, hold on a second. Do you know what I mean? There is a looking back and a lens which looks at our world differently. And there's one line that I said at Azer this last cycle, which I actually read from somebody else, that seemed to hit in a way that, when you say things that you're like, I didn't mean whatever that is, kind of thing. And it's the phrase that loyalty is not a fruit of the spirit. I think it was what's her name? KJ Ramsey, who's a therapist and a writer. And I remember seeing it on a post she wrote and talking about what we've done in the name of loyalty. In the name of loyalty to an institution, loyalty to a person, where we've overworked, where we've allowed ourselves to be underpaid, where we have not spoken up about things, and where we've protected, protected the big things, but protected the little problems, which have now become big problems. There is a kind of reckoning I'm seeing where people are like, enough already, enough. I have been faithful, I've done this, and what you're telling me is I'm still underpaid. Or I've tried this, what you're saying is I'm never going to get that opportunity on that platform because I don't fit your mold. And almost this dawning, and some of the tiredness that women have been living with is the trying to cope with that all along. That's one thing that I've seen, which I'm like, wow, I don't know what we do about this, but this is real. And I see it around the country a lot. And I remember writing about that in a newsletter and having the biggest response I've had in years to the whole thing of how we've used loyalty as currency and how it has bankrupted us.
That's so good. So good. And I think that singular statement, loyalty is not a fruit of the spirit, just really hits, right? What have we sacrificed in the name of loyalty? So I would love to know, what do you think the future of female leadership looks like?
Any particular context?
I mean, I would say in Christian circles, because I do think the marketplace and in Christian circles, female leadership looks wildly different. So I would say, as we move the kingdom forward, as we do work through God's calling in our lives, how does this look different in the future?
I think we are, and I think we're seeing the beginnings of this. I think there is a lot more women building their own tables because I think some of the more institutional expressions don't feel very forward focused. They feel like sometimes in times of change, you dig in, don't you? It's like, I'm not moving anywhere. I'm staying as I used to. And I think there is some of that. But I think there is and maybe it's the availability of doing podcasts or self-publishing or, the changes and shifts in education where you can learn skills at prices that are a little more humane, I think we will see women build their own tables more because they have to, because they want to, because they can do, and bringing what they can bear. I think maybe we sometimes, like you say, the business world, and that those things are in a different place. And sometimes we pick up those books and we're like, hold on a second. Do you know what I mean? I could do this. And I think also the cost of living may require it. You know, the cost of doing life may require it. I mean, there are a lot of double income households anyway, but I think those kinds of things, sometimes we move forward by force. And I think the building your own table, because what's a woman supposed to do if she's got a message to write and a book deal's never going to come away? What's she supposed to do with that? Well, I'm just trying to be faithful. Well, I'll find a way. I'll Substack or something else instead. I think I'm seeing that more and more. And I actually think that kind of disruption is a positive thing.
Yeah, more women sharing the message and hopefully expanding the kingdom, but not necessarily doing it in the context of how it's been done in the past. And it's exciting.
I think it is exciting because then we do get that range of women again. We do get that range rather than step through this door and be like this and come out this way. It stops the conveyor belt. Disruption can feel awkward for some, but I think it can be really invigorating as well.
Mm-hmm. All right, Jo, I have one final question for you around leadership. It kind of relates to what we are just saying, because so much of what we are seeing in the church space in particular is leaders who maybe they've built their own table, or maybe they are successful within the confines of whatever structure they're in. But then there is a failure. There is a moral falling. There is a break in integrity, whatever it is. And you mentioned the importance of accountability earlier. And I think this even relates to this idea of women building their own table, because like Holly and I do this podcast, like technically we don't have anyone telling us what to do. We could say whatever we want. So how do we build in that accountability into our leadership life? And maybe even if you want to share how that has looked for you over the years.
I think that we've got to keep on asking ourselves what we can do to stay grounded. And so I think I'll say for me first, and then I'll do the other bits. For me, it's really important that I'm integrated into the life of a local church. That's key for me. And that's not always been an easy thing for me, because some of the pain of my life has been in church contexts. But then it's like, find a place I can be. That's just a normalizing thing. I want normalizing parts of my life. So that's one part. For me, there are broken parts of my history. The question is what I'm doing with them. So therapy is not an option for me. It's do you need this? Yeah. Okay. Then you're going to do this. And other people need to know that. I try to have a life where there is nothing in my life that is a secret. It's not that everybody knows my business, but somebody's got to. Are there people who can tell me I'm wrong? I need to be the kind of woman who not only allows herself to be wrong, but allows people to tell me I'm wrong. Am I the kind of woman who's willing to say sorry, and not sorry you feel that way, because sometimes that sorry is weird sorry. It's a faux apology. Are you able to say sorry? I think that some of those things help. And then I would say for each of us, we need to know our vices. And I'm really glad you brought up this question about accountability, Esther, because, growing up for me, there was a lot of information about sex. People talk about sex all the time. I'm like, okay, I get it. You don't want me to, do you know what I mean? They talked about sex all the time. Talk about money. No one talked about power. And I really, really wish they did. I really wish I'd been better discipled to understand power, because I tell you, first of all, I'd have understood the thing about money and sex a whole lot better. But also, I think that what we do with power, whether we're willing to admit we have power, how we steward power, is one of our biggest threats. Again and again and again. I have seen believers, good people, take other people out because they have been clumsy with power. Hold on to positions and opportunities way longer. It's like watching milk go off. Do you know what I mean? It's great when it's tasty, but when it's off, because they've needed the power. They have hoarded opportunity, hoarded their own platforms and spaces because of power. And I think you need someone in your life, and you need environments in your life where you have to talk through the issues of power. I think that's just vital for us. I feel it raw at the minute because I hear story after story, and my text messages are blowing up with yet another story of a situation where there's been an abuse of power. A couple, actually, abuses of power. And I'm like, oh man, Accountability is uncomfortable. Would I like everybody to know my business? No. Do I want to admit that I have vices in my life? No. Do I want to admit that the broken parts of my history still, my goodness, I'm nearly 50 and certain things still impact me? No, I don't want anybody to know that. And I don't want that to be me. I would love to present picture perfect, got it together Jo. I really would. It's just not going to happen. So in the meantime, what am I going to do with that? And I tell you, the other thing I'm realizing is that's not a one and done. I need to keep asking myself, are the accountability structures that I have still working, or were they for a previous era in my life? And as my leadership has grown, is that still robust? Or do I need to sharpen it a bit? Do I need to fine tune it a bit? Am I still in, people move house. Do you know what I mean? It's not even big things. It's just like your friend has moved and so you don't see him as much. Do you still have that person locally then who sees your life? And then there are things that we can choose to do. Like, what are you doing in your life? So for me, I have certain principles in terms of, there are some things that I'm a real believer in equity and financial equity and getting paid what you deserve and all that kind of stuff. But some things I've just got to do for free. I'm not saying everybody does. I have to, because I need to keep on putting myself in positions that just upset and disrupt me a little, that require a dependency on the Lord in a different way. I need to serve in spaces where there is no benefit to me and I get no credit and nobody knows, where it's unattractive and all of those things. I need to humble myself. That's where the dose of humility can come in this stuff. Those are some of the things I would invite us to consider. And you want to have healthy people speaking into your life and healthy environments speaking into your life as a lifestyle, not as a moment.
Oh my gosh, I feel like we could do an entire episode on this idea of power and how we disciple people to understand it and what that practically looks like, just because of, I think we've seen, and I think that power is built on that loyalty that we were talking about, right?
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And yeah.
I mean, I hate it. I can assume we've all been, here's the hard thing about it. I hate the fact that I've never spoken to you two before, and yet I know that all three of us in our stories will have a situation where we're like, dang it. Yeah. About power, about loyalty, and the taken advantage of in some way. I'm not saying physically, I'm not saying sexually, but in some way, because this culture of power and celebrity and popularity being more important than integrity and an audience being a bigger deal than an anointing, all of those things have in some ways, we've swum in this a little while now.
And it's quote unquote so much easier to have a platform than it ever was in the past. Yeah. And so you can give the illusion of power for a longer time.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Until you get it, right?
Oh, that's so true. I hadn't thought about it like that. That's almost like the underbelly of the opportunities.
Yeah.
And the unintended consequences of the opportunity. That's so true. Oh gosh, that's actually depressing as well, but very true.
Well, it's depressing for me, from the consumer side of it, of who do you trust? Yeah. And who do you know that's gone through the hard stuff to get there, and who maintains accountability? Because from the outside, you don't actually know unless they talk about it.
Yeah.
So I do love when leaders, and this is something, a conversation my husband and I had when as we've moved, we've gone to different churches, and we were recollecting over time which of our pastors have talked about their own accountability that they have built into their lives, and just comparing and contrasting that. So I do think, as a little side note, it's important to talk about that in your platform, because it helps people discern to some extent whether you're worthy of being followed.
Well, and the values, because I think we have projected things. I wrestle with signing books.
Yeah.
I wrestle with it because I'm like, what are the unintended consequences of this? And so what's the narrative that we need to give and that we need to attend to because of, all the things you said?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I have to keep myself accountable because we are over on our time.
I'm having such a good time. I wasn't even thinking about it.
Do you want to do another
we don't
hour?
Want to tie you down, but we can keep talking, Jo.
I'm happy to keep talking because I always give myself buffer because I get into conversations.
Oh,
so if you have any more, I'm in. We could do this for as long as you want. I don't mind. But you may have things in your day, so I don't want to get in the way of your day.
All right, Joe. Well, we could just keep going. And I loved that we wrapped up with this conversation on accountability because it's really been heavy on my own heart lately. And I think what you shared at the end is worth every minute of the listener's time listening today. So, but we always share that we believe leaders are learners. And we know that most of the leaders we talk to are always investing in themselves, either listening to things, reading books, finding resources that are impacting them. So is there something that maybe has made an impact for you lately that you would want to share with our audience?
Oh, I listen to a lot of podcasts. Oh, actually, no, there are a couple of things. Ruth Haley Barton's got this book and a podcast about Sabbath and sabbatical. I can't remember. And the title, I can see the book in the other side of the room, so I can't go over and find it. And her podcast season has been talking about that. And that has impacted me a lot. Both of them have kind of they've just made me think a lot on how hard I work and what is not necessary and almost the fears behind what I work, how I work and stuff. And, when you're self-employed, you're like, well, if I don't work, I don't get. So, and it has helped me break up with some of the fears behind that. So yes, I'm sorry, everybody, that I can't remember the title of a book, but it's brilliant. And it's the most recent book and it's about Sabbath and it's about sabbatical. And that's great. That has helped me a lot. I listen to a lot of podcasts. Guy Raz has this one called How I Built This. He has this one called Wisdom from the Top. And he has one called The Great Creators. And those are just about different creatives. And it's been really it's what it's done. I mean, someone asked me, what's your favorite one of those episodes? What's your favorite interview? And I started listing. I said, oh, and that person. They're like, you're really helpful. You've just listed the entire season. Thank you. Thank you for that. But I think why it's helped me is because it's reminded me of parts of me that I buried for so long in the name of doing the sensible thing and the sensible work. So just immersing myself and listening to something which is something I love, but haven't touched for a while, has undone me in ways I didn't quite anticipate. So yeah, those would probably be the things that I'm learning from most at the moment that have been really, really wonderful, really helpful.
Well, finally, we have talked about some pretty heavy things, a few depressing things. So I would love, you have the mic, and I would love you to speak to our audience with any sort of words of encouragement or wisdom for female leaders as we kind of close and maybe lighten their loads a little.
I want to remind us, I think like you say, when we think about these sorts of things, it's like, oh my gosh, this is awful or whatever. And maybe it's made us realize some things and all of that. And I just want you to know that it's not too late. It's not too late. You're not too old. You're not too young. Your marital status isn't going to define this. And that he really is a redeemer and that his mercies really are new every morning. And for those of you who feel like you're too much, you're not too much for him. It might feel too much for other people. That doesn't mean you're too much for other people. It might just feel like that to them. You're not enough for him. And you can take this one step at a time. So I simply want to encourage you to allow you to almost, if you've kind of sat there all locked up, you can unclench your fists and you can open your arms and you can take a deep breath and you can start again. And whether you're starting again because you failed in the past or whether you're starting again because you've buried it for a long time or you've realized the dynamics of relationships, he's not going to abandon you in this. He's with you. You're joining with him in what he's doing, not achieving a leadership call on his behalf. And he loves you and he likes you. So he's going to walk with you. And I know we have not lived through many hopeful years recently, but there is still hope in our future because of him. And I would simply invite us to put our hand in his hand in whatever way that looks like for us and allow the scope of his vision for us to define our lives rather than the limitations of ours.
Such a beautiful way to close us out, Jo. So thank you so much for this conversation and for going into the hard stuff with us. We appreciate it. Our audience knows that we're not afraid of going deep and asking the hard questions. So I know that they will walk away with great insights today. And I'm also sure that they will want to connect with you and follow you if they're not already doing so. So tell us, how can people connect with you? What's the best place? And if there's any resources you want to mention, feel free.
Yeah, my website is josaxton.com, @Jo Saxton on the socials or LinkedIn. And I'm on them in various, I don't do Twitter much anymore. I've got to be honest. So sorry if that's your jam. It really isn't mine. So other than that, though, I'm around, host a podcast called Lead Stories. You can connect there. In terms of resources and stuff, Lead Stories I would recommend, but also, like I said at the beginning, on my website, it shows all the things. It's got like book, blah, 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 all of those stuff. One of the reasons why I was excited about doing this today is the next theme for our next Aza Collective is use your voice, and acknowledging that our voices have taken a bit of a battering at different times, or we're just uncertain about it. And it's about public stuff, but it's also about using your voice in the boardroom, the whole, or conflict resolution, the whole gamut. I just invite you, if that's something you're interested in, whether you're leading in business or whether you're doing your own business or you're in ministry, head over to the website, josaxton.com. There's a tab, Aza Collective, and you'll find out about the early bird discounts, the group discounts. We're doing it in Minneapolis and in Portland over the next year or so, and you're invited. Take this as your personal invitation before you say, should it be me? Yes, you're invited. Come along and find out what's a fit for you and bring your people and come. It'd be great to see you.
Well, now any of our listeners can show up and say, well, Jo personally invited me.
There you go. I did.
To come.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Jo, for this authentic conversation and all of the golden nuggets and gems that you've dropped along the way. We so appreciate it. And I am super appreciative. Having you on the podcast has been sort of a bucket list item for our podcast. And so This has been wonderful and I'm super enjoyed it. So thank you for your time.
I have too. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us on the Christian Women Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, would you consider leaving us a rating and review in your podcast app? This helps more women just like you find the podcast, and it also helps them to know whether the podcast would be a good fit for them. Just go to the show in your podcast app, then scroll down until you see the option for ratings and reviews. From there, you can tap to rate and write a review. It means the world to us when you take a couple minutes to do this, and thank you so much to everyone who has left a review. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.